Hello everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm talking about fairy tales with tragic endings. There are a lot of older versions of fairy tales that really are kind of gruesome and unpleasant, and that's not really what I want to talk about here, but it's worth acknowledging from the beginning. There's a version of Cinderella where the stepsisters, in order to try and fit their feet into the slipper, they mutilate their feet by cutting pieces of it off. And then there's blood in the shoe, and that's how the prince knows that they're not really the girl that he danced with. But we're not here to talk about that today. What we're here to talk about is fairy tales that just straight up don't have a happy ending. No happily ever after here. And originally I was going to do 5, but then I realized if I did 5, it would just be 5 Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales, so it's 10 instead, so that I can bring in some from other sources as well. And I'm actually going to talk about the first 3 as a group. The first 3 stories that I want to talk about are The Little Mermaid, The Red Shoes, and The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen. Y'all all know the story of The Little Mermaid, I'm assuming. Mermaid falls in love with human prince, sells her tail and her voice to the sea witch in exchange for legs, has to get him to fall in love with her in order to stay human. In the original version, the catch is that if he marries someone else, she will turn to sea foam and die, but because she refuses the choice she's given an option to kill him and the human girl and return to the ocean as a mermaid, she refuses to take it. So her reward for doing that is that when she goes to the sea thinking that she'll be turned into sea foam, she instead ascends towards heaven and has an opportunity to do good deeds and earn her way to heaven. The Red Shoes is a story about a girl who has a pair of red shoes. She thinks that they look very nice. She's a little bit vain and prideful about them. She wears them to church and thinks about them rather than the sermon. She starts dancing and she can't stop dancing, and that happens, I think, twice, and the second time her feet have to literally be amputated in order to get the shoes to stop dancing. And the shoes go on and keep dancing with her feet in them. Her feet just aren't attached to her anymore. Yeah. Yikes, right? In any case, she lives a short and miserable life and dies, and at the end goes to heaven, and nobody there mentioned the red shoes to her. And then the third one, The Little Match Girl, is about a Jewish girl who just wants to convert to Christianity, which I'm not even gonna touch that. And she also has a terrible, miserable life and suffers a great deal, and the ending is that she dies and goes to heaven. So this guy had a thing for writing stories about young girls who suffer a great deal, live short and miserable lives, and the happy ending is that they went to heaven. That's really not what you would normally think of when you think of fairy tale endings, but it was actually a very common thing in Hans Christian Andersen's writing. Number 4 on my list is another story by Andersen, The Steadfast Tin Soldier. And in my opinion, this one is actually more depressing than the 3 that I just mentioned, because at least the 3 that I just mentioned have a little glimmer of hope at the end. This one doesn't at all. It's about this tin soldier who falls in love with this toy ballerina, and he ends up on this crazy, weird adventure that takes him out of the safety of the house where they both live, and it's kind of Toy Story-like in that we're giving personalities and thoughts and feelings and whatnot to inanimate objects, and specifically children's toys. But at the end, he winds up back at the same place where he started. The little boy picks him up, takes a look at him, and is like, I don't want this, and throws him in the fire, and he melts. And then the toy ballerina is blown by a gust of wind from the window and also goes into the fire and burns up. That's it. That's the ending. And then number 5 on my list, another one by Andersen. You see what I mean when I said if I were to do a top 5, they would all be his. The Rose Elf. The Rose Elf is a story about an elf that lives in a beautiful garden inside of a rose, and it has to go inside the rosebud every night to go to sleep, because otherwise the petals shut it out, and it can't get back in. And one night that's exactly what happens. And you know what happens then? It witnesses a murder. And then it follows the murderer home and tells his younger sister, who's the woman that the murder victim loved, all about what happened in a dream, and leaves evidence that it was not just a dream. And then eventually, through a long and complicated series of events, she ends up pining away with grief, and he gets revenge for her and her lover by something to do with flowers poisoning the guy, I think, and also bees who want to sting him to death. It's really complicated, it's really unpleasant, and there's not much hope or happiness in the ending. It starts off like so sugary sweet, and then it becomes like nightmarish very, very quickly. Next up is The Juniper Tree by the Grimm brothers. The Juniper Tree begins with a woman who wishes for a child as white as snow and as red as blood, and if you think this is Snow White, you are wrong. Well, mostly. So the child is a boy, not a girl, but the mother does pass away, much like Snow White's mother, and the father remarries to an evil stepmother. The evil stepmother and the father have a child of their own, a little girl, and the little girl and the little boy actually got along really well. But the stepmother, of course, is the evil stepmother. So what does she do? She murders her stepson, she cooks him and feeds him to her husband, the boy's father, and the sister, the little sister, is, absolutely grief-stricken by this, but is tricked into not saying anything. But she buries his bones under the juniper tree, and his spirit comes back as a bird, and the bird goes around collecting items. And it gives nice things to the father and the half-sister, but it drops a millstone on the head of the stepmother. And that's how it ends. That's how the story ends. And then on a very similar note, The Singing Bone by the Grimm brothers. Now, if you're familiar with folklore at all, the words the singing bone, even if you're not familiar with that particular Grimm brothers fairy tale, may tell you what kind of story this is going to be. There are two brothers. They go off to kill a wild boar because that is what one has to do to marry the princess. One of them succeeds at that while the other one is getting drunk at a tavern, but the one who was getting drunk at the tavern kills his brother, takes the carcass of the boar, and marries the princess. This traveler comes by, sees the bones, doesn't realize, I don't think that they're human bones, carves one into the mouthpiece for a horn. And when he blows on the horn and plays music, the voice of the murdered brother tells the story. There's a lot of folk tales that go along those lines. I think there's at least one or two ballads like that. It's a pretty common storyline, but yeah, compared to a lot of what we normally think of as fairy tales, it's a very depressing story with no happy ending. Next up, also by the Grimm brothers, The Sun Brings It to Light. Now, this is one that's about a murderer who, as his victim is dying, he says that he can try to cover it up, but the sun will bring it to light. In other words, if he tries to conceal what he did, it'll eventually be revealed. This guy takes these words about the sun bringing it to light very, very literally. And one day, years later, when he's sitting with his wife and the sun is shining in through the window, he tells the sun that it can try to bring it to light if it wants to, but it's not going to happen. And his wife is like, "Oh, what are we talking about here?" And she pesters him until he tells her. And she's like, "Oh, of course, I won't tell anyone. Your secret's totally safe with me." But she goes and tells her friend. And her friend goes and tells other people. And then all of a sudden the whole town knows, and now this guy is being, accused of murder and is going to, have to go to court. And the sun did, in fact, bring it to light. I mean, in a way, it's kind of a satisfying ending because the murderer is eventually brought to justice, even if it's a long time in the future. But on the other hand, it's not what we normally think of as a fairy tale, and particularly not what we would normally think of as a happily ever after. The next one that I want to talk about, also by the Grimm brothers, is called The Stolen Farthings. The Stolen Farthings is about this house that's haunted by the ghost of a child, and the ghost of the child leads the people living there to this place where hidden under the floorboards are some farthings, a small amount of money, which was meant to be given to the poor, but the child instead hid it away for himself. And once they give the stolen farthings to a poor man, the ghost ceases to be there. It never bothers them again. It's implied that this was, in a lot of ghost stories, the ghost has some kind of unfinished business before it can move on into the next life, and that was this ghost child's unfinished business. There are a lot of other stories from the Grimm brothers collection that could also go on this list, but because I don't want this to be an entirely Grimm brothers list either, let's move on to Little Red Riding Hood, specifically the version by Charles Perrault. There are a lot of different versions of Little Red Riding Hood. There are some where the girl and her grandmother both escape the wolf's belly alive, which I don't understand how that happens because they were literally eaten, but, whatever, it's a fairy tale. There are versions like the one that my mother told me as a kid where, Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother never got eaten by the wolf. She was just locked in the closet the whole time. There are versions where the grandmother does get eaten and is not rescued, but Little Red Riding Hood herself is able to outwit the wolf and survive. And there's the version by Charles Perrault. And in his version, the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood both get eaten, and there is no convenient woodsman to come and cut them out of its belly somehow miraculously still alive. They just get eaten. That's it. Little Red Riding Hood gets eaten by the wolf. End of story. So, as you can see, even though we typically associate fairy tales with happily ever after endings, a lot of them in their older forms really didn't have that. And a lot of the ones that do have happy endings, really it's a question of like, is it really a happy ending? Are you sure? Like, okay, so my favorite example of this is Rumpelstiltskin. The girl can't really spin straw into gold, but because of her deal with Rumpelstiltskin, she's able to prove that she can, and then ends up married to the king, who said that if she couldn't, he would have her killed. And to me, that's not a happy ending, because first of all, she's married to someone who threatened to have her killed, and secondly, she can't really do the thing that she said that she could do. So what happens the next time the royal treasury runs low on money? Well, he's gonna say, hey honey, can you spin us some gold? And she's gonna be like, haha, yeah, funny story, can't really do that. I just don't see it being a happy ending in the long term. But these don't even require that kind of like critical thought or looking at it from a different angle kind of thing. They're just tragic. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with y'all because I've been thinking about Little Mermaid recently with the new live action Disney movie coming up, and that got me thinking about fairy tales that don't have happily ever after endings. Anyway, I hope that you found this video interesting. If you liked it and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe.